So there's this dispute, right, when it comes to the nature of the Trump administration as it relates to previous Republican presidencies. On one side, it's the view that this represents a break from past Republican presidencies, that this really isn't in the tradition of previous Republicanisms. And the other view is that, no, this is pretty much in continuity with previous Republican presidencies. And I've always had a view that was kind of a blend of the two, which is that the character of Trump and his administration does represent a break with the past. Trump's disdain for traditional democratic norms, his view of the country as not a unified whole, but as two separate partisan camps for whom he's only responsible to one, his sense that he embodies the nation itself, and that any disagreement with him is tantamount to a kind of treason against the nation. His real and obvious contempt for civic nationalism, for the kinds of rituals that bring Americans together. All of these mark him as a break with past presidents first, but also a break with past Republican presidents. And I think those breaks, especially when it comes to his real desire to centralize all of government around his person, are meaningful and should be taken seriously. But then there's also plenty of continuity. So much continuity that you could reliably predict what the administration was going to attempt to do based simply on the fact that it was a Republican presidential administration. What do Republican presidents and Republican Congresses like to do in domestic policy? They like to deregulate and they like to cut taxes. And they tell voters that these things will bring prosperity. They never do. But that's what they say, and that's what they do. And Trump, in both of his terms, has presided over huge upper income tax cuts and massive deregulation. In this term, especially not just deregulating, but gutting the government's capacity to even stand as a counterweight to entrenched interests. Now, there are some things about domestic policy under Trump that are distinctly Trump. The whole Maha, Make America Healthy Again, RFK Jr., anti-vax thing is not something you'd see under previous presidencies. You would see cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, or attempts to make those cuts. You would see attempts to make cuts to other social insurance programs like food stamps and temporary aid for needy families. And those are all things Trump has done, right, in keeping with previous Republican presidencies. But the Maha stuff is unique. Other things that are in clear continuity are the subversion of agencies like the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, not to pursue voting discrimination, but to turn them against efforts to ameliorate racial discrimination. That's pretty much in keeping with George W. Bush and Reagan. And even a certain amount of executive impunity, right, is very much in keeping with previous Republican presidencies. Most famously, Richard Nixon. Watergate was simply the most egregious episode in years of executive impunity, using the DOJ and the IRS in particular to harass his political enemies. That should sound familiar to you. But then Ronald Reagan had Iran-Contra, an effort to circumvent Congress's power over the purse to pursue foreign policy objectives.
The other major issue of the hearings, of course, was the diversion of funds to the Nicaraguan Contras.
Again, should sound familiar to you. George H.W. Bush pardoned many of the Iran-Contra conspirators, and George W. Bush was engaged in, among other things, an illegal torture program, all meant to circumvent congressional oversight. This should sound familiar to you. So in those very clear ways, Trump is continuity with the past. He is behaving in much the same way as previous Republican presidents, turned up a notch, obviously, turned to 11, you might say.
These go to 11.
But still recognizable based off of what you've seen in previous Republican presidencies. Now, you could make the argument that because of the distinctly anti-democratic character of Trump, this aping of previous Republican transgressions becomes all the more egregious. I would say that those previous Republican transgressions paved the way for this, and not just previous Republican transgressions, but the extent to which Democratic presidents in the interim have not really meaningfully pushed back on these things. I bring all this up because I do think that this war in Iran makes the continuity case all the more clear. Iran was, you might remember, infamously part of Bush's axis of evil.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world,
along with Iraq and North Korea. And it's been an objective of neoconservatives and other right-wingers in the Republican foreign policy orbit to try to go to war with Iran, to depose that regime. Even in Trump's previous term, his second Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was very clearly eager to try to launch some strike against Iran. So under Trump and under Republicans generally, this is probably a long time coming. In any case, what we see here from Trump is an example of the real continuity his administration represents with previous Republicans. If you were to simply try to guess what a Republican president might do in 2025 and 2026, cut taxes and attempt a war in the Middle East is pretty much at the top of the list. It's an important reminder that is pretty much entirely lost in most discourse about American elections, that when you're selecting a president, you're not just electing that one guy. You're electing a government. You're electing a coalition. You're electing the people who aren't just going to be in the White House, but whom are going to staff the entire federal bureaucracy. You're electing the people who are going to be advising the president and putting ideas in his ear. You're going to be electing a coalition of groups and individuals who have interests that they want that president to pursue. The president, in a lot of ways, is merely the most visible part of a large and hard to see political formation. And one of the jobs of people like me is to try to make that political formation all the more visible, so that you understand that when you choose a president, you're not just choosing this one person who's in the White House, but everyone who might have access to presidential power in a very literal sense. And so in 2024, despite the fact that Trump called himself a peace candidate, despite the fact that J.D. Vance said that Trump would not start any new wars, you should have recognized that Trump would be at the helm of a coalition that has an ideological and material interest in trying to pursue conflict against Iran and trying to pursue conflict in the Middle East. That, to me, might be the immediate political lesson of all of this. We elected a Republican president, and the Republican president is doing things that Republican presidents do. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you'd like to see more like it, you should like, subscribe, and then check out this video on another subject happening in American politics. See you next time.